Welcome everybody to session 40 of Classic Metal Class. We're going to be talking today about a topic we've kicked around a bit before, but never fully approached, and that is the role of one particular instrument in heavy metal. And it's not the guitar, it's not the bass, it's not the drums, it's not even vocals, it's keyboards, because it can be a little controversial. I think many of us who are old enough remember growing up and seeing Iron Maiden's famous liner notes on Peace of Mind, no synthesizers or ulterior motives. So we're going to talk about that sentiment. But as it turns out, keyboards of various sorts have played a really important role in heavy metal since the origins of it. And maybe it's not just okay to have keyboards. I think some people think it's a little, misplaced or wimpy, or, looks bad to have keyboards. But I think you can make an argument. So that's kind of what we're doing here, that there's a legitimate place for keyboards in heavy metal, and there has been from the start. It's not just like an addition in the 90s. Yeah. So if you think about like the image of heavy metal, you got like the guys out there, think about, say the Scorpions or Iron Maiden or any other 5-piece band, Judas Priest, where you've got two guitarists, a bassist, a singer, and a drummer. And the drummer's, on stage, and he's big in the back, and he's, hammering away at his drums. Maybe if it's really cool, pyrotechnics are going off behind him. Then you got the singer out there doing his thing. And then you got the three guitarists out there, lining up with their guitars, like doing the thing. They're all doing it at the same time. Keyboards just do not have that sort of theatricality. Instead you got a guy who's off generally on the side, plunking away at his stuff. There's ways to make it metal, ways to make it part of the pageantry, but we don't usually think about that too much. So we're gonna focus on a lot of different things here: bands, technology, what actually keyboards contribute musically. I think, and Scott, I'd be interested in your take on this. When people think about keyboards in the classic era, so the 70s and the 80s, keyboards wind up getting associated with other kinds of music a lot more. So on the one hand, we have like prog rock and psychedelic rock that are like, in some respects predecessors, and you've got like a keyboard guy or maybe even two guys with that, and it's cool to have that. And then as we move into like the late 70s and early 80s, we've got like disco and soft rock and new wave and new romantic and even synth pop, where the keyboard is really cool to have. It's front and center. You look at the videos and there's a guy like, playing away. Like think about Duran Duran as a prime example. You have a guitarist, you've got a singer, you've got a drummer, a bassist, and then you got the keyboard player, and he's considered just as cool as anybody else. Why doesn't that track into metal,
Well, because the guitar has a different role in Duran Duran, first of all.
Yeah.
So it's not really a front and center. I mean, the singer will always kind of be the focal point, but the guitar in a lot of the stuff in the time period you're talking about was more of a textural instrument. Maybe they would have some cool rocking part, but it could have been kind of more of a clean part. But like take Some Like It Hot, like the Power Station song.
Oh yeah.
Like that kind of stuff. But keyboards in that era were like a very important part of the sound. So it was more prominent than the guitar as far as, and like even on stage, the picture you painted about the metalheads like lining up, it's a whole different show. It's a whole different showing when like a band like Duran Duran or Power Station or Go West or whoever, it's a whole different pecking order, I think.
I was just laughing because I was thinking about sort of an image thing, and some may want to weigh in on this, who were there at the start. So when we were metalheads as teenagers, as kids in, 70s and 80s, there was a lot of playing air guitar, right?
Oh
And
God,
you thrash your head while you're playing air guitar, especially if somebody's soloing. I think a lot of people played air drums as well. And I don't know, maybe some people played air bass. I don't know how you'd tell that apart from air guitar other than like the
if you were
fingers.
Steve Harris.
There you go. But nobody, as far as I've ever seen, was playing air keyboards.
Actually, I don't know. I think, if we talk about like Deep Purple,
okay,
with those epic solos, or maybe the signature part like Jump, for example.
Yeah.
But you're right. It wasn't quite as effective. It was a different kind of mimicking. It had a different sentiment to it, I think.
Yeah. So Ken says, true, nobody ever played air keyboards. Ken is weighing in from growing up in Great Britain, and which is kind of, a hotbed for all of this sort of stuff.
Yes.
And Andrew has a question, the thing that we're going to get to in a moment. Are we including the awesome keytars, or is that too close to a synthesizer? So a little bit of a reveal. We are going to talk about synths quite a bit. And the keytar, and also the thing that Edgar Winter did, where he like clipped a keyboard to his
right.
chest, sort of like, basically like a guitar strap. I guess it would have to be a little bit more heavy duty, because it probably weighed a good bit more. Those are all fair game, and as you know, so actually this is a good segue into talking about it. So Iron Maiden had no synthesizers or ulterior motives. Queen, earlier than that, in 1974, on their Sheer Heart Attack album notes, wrote no synthesizer. And I don't think the sentiment was so much like no keyboards, right? There's something different about a synthesizer. If you're John Lord playing a Hammond organ, there's virtuosity involved there, and you can't just like set up a loop, and let it play or anything like that. Whereas I think there was a feeling that synthesizers were making things too easy, making things less workmanlike, less authentic. And so maybe that's part of what was driving that sentiment. You don't want to rely on synths because you're less of a musician then. You're doing like what the synth pop people are doing, or the new wave people.
And for them to use it as a badge of honor in there, kind of like no synthesizers, they had to take time to put in the liner notes. And we have to add that there were no synthesizers because the metalheads will love it, because we're the real thing. I mean, I think that's the point of putting that in your liner notes. Because it's not like somebody's going to hear synthesizers. I guess what I'm saying is it's different. Like, let's say I get my guitar to sound kind of like a synthesizer with some stuff. And then we want to say, by the way, there was no synthesizers. What you hear isn't synthesizer. It's actually something else we created. But if you're saying it as a badge of honor, there's a different sentiment set to it.
Yeah. That's an interesting one, because again, total side topic, but you think about the virtuosic guitar sound development that takes place, not just in metal, but hard rock, with people doing weird stuff and getting their guitars to do things that you wouldn't think a guitar could. I suppose maybe that would make sense to put that in there. Andy asks, are you going to discuss the Chapman stick? And we won't be discussing that, although that's a very interesting thing to talk about. Maybe down the line when we do a similar thing on bass guitar, that would fit in there well. For those who don't know, the Chapman stick is this weird, crazy instrument that has all these strings on it and does all this cool stuff. And I think you
play it like this.
Yeah, you almost got to be like a genius to figure out how to play it.
I mean, it depends on how virtuoso. Like Tony Levin is like a virtuoso on it.
Yeah,
and that was used in King Crimson, and that kind of stuff. So that was, but it's more like there's two sides to it. Like there's the fretboards like this, and
Yeah.
this part is this hand, this part is this hand, and you kind of play two things at once. It's kind of like almost like a piano, but it's just a stick that kind of goes like this. And
Yeah, I guess in that you do play it sort of like a piano. It's semi keyboard, isn't it?
I mean, it still has frets and strings.
Yeah. So I guess we could say it's kind of a hybrid instrument, right?
Yeah. Plus, once you get into electric ones like that, you can get very synthy. Well, we could even talk about synth guitar, but that's not quite the same. That's just mimicking a synth.
Yeah. So
I
Ken
guess.
says to some extent the no synth liner notes were a differentiator. Keyboards were the central piece of late 70s, early 80s electro pop. So many bands wanted to distance themselves from that prevailing popular music. Yeah, heavy metal was a subculture and cement
Yes,
their counterculture credentials. I think that's quite true.
that's great. Yeah.
So let's move into like one of the key topics. What is it that keyboards are actually doing? What's the musical contribution? So I wrote down a few things and I figured we could riff off of those. Scott, I'm sure you have a lot more to contribute. I think that one thing that we could talk about at the start is that there are bands where the keyboards are absolutely integral to the sound. You don't have that band without the keyboard. And I would say the prime example of that would be John Lord's organ playing in Deep Purple, not just in the 70s album, but it's equally there in 1984's Perfect Strangers after the band reunites. They could have like made it more guitar heavy or something like that, but that Hammond organ is still like doing its major part. Ken Hensley's playing in Uriah Heep, I think, is another prime example. If you take the song Gypsy or Bird of Prey, which are arguably heavy metal songs, you don't have the song without the organ playing there. By the way, Deep Purple and Uriah Heep at some points were actually recording in the same studio, just in separate rooms from each other. So they'd walk back and forth and check each other out. And I think along the same lines, you can say that bands that are not as dependent on the keyboard are using it to add a heaviness to the riffs, where the organ or the synthesizer is acting like a heavy second guitar, and occasionally taking off as a solo instrument. I would say that a great example of that is UFO's song "Lights Out." Where
Yeah.
Paul Raymond is on the keyboards. So I'm kind of interested, because I have a sense about this, but I'm not a like professional musician, and I don't have all these things, easily arranged in my head. So when you're listening to something like, Deep Purple's Highway Star,
Yes.
or Uriah Heep's Gypsy, or UFO's Lights Out, and you're noticing, okay, the guitar is doing this, and they all have great guitarists: Richie Blackmore, Mick Box, Michael Schechner at that time, guitar heroes. They all have great bassists. Lights Out is probably one of Pete Way's best bass line things. And, they've all got great singers too. What is the keyboard doing for you as you're listening to this?
Early on, when you're using the B3s, those were, it's interesting because in soul music, it was used, obviously, right?
Yeah.
But what heavy metal keyboardists did is they actually played them through Marshalls. And what happened was they'd crank the Marshall up, and the B3 would actually get distorted like a guitar.
Right.
So we're still talking pretty earthy, relative without being a piano. We're still talking about like, the real sound from the instrument, and then cranking the Marshalls up really like, the Highway Star solo. That's metal. It's a great, but like part of that is cranking it through these tube amps that would break up and give you that extra metal kind of sound to it, that angry, that angsty kind of you would raise your fist to that. You know, it wouldn't be like a light little, like the solo, go back to like the solo to Jump.
Yeah.
You know, like that's a synthesizer solo, and that's a little maybe prettier is the wrong word, but you know, it's a little more.
Does part of it have to do with the low end? So like you think about Jump and you think about Highway Star, right? Now John Lord has like a full keyboard in front of him, but you know, and a keyboard is a greater range typically than a guitar, unless you're going to add like extra strings or something. He seems to be playing a lot. The heaviness is coming in part from the low end, right? Whereas Jump, it's dun 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 dun, you know, the kind of like stringy, I don't know what you would call it, yeah,
or pseudo stringy. I think is the problem. People, if you really get down to it, they have the problem with, you know, oh, that's a synth playing like in the 80s when there was a keyboard called the DX7, and that came out in the maybe right before the mid 80s, and it would say, oh, it's, you know, it can sound like an organ, but it didn't sound like an organ. It sounded like a DX7 organ-y sound, and it was much less you couldn't get that roar. Like if we go back to Highway Star.
Ooh, that's a good descriptor, a roar. Yeah,
like, you know, the solo for the first 4 bars starts out on the low end, just like kind of coming up and building this roar from the low end of the B3, where the DX7 didn't even have that range and didn't have the capability, and they weren't running them through Marshalls either.
Yeah.
So I think in the 70s, I mean, even if you go to like listen to Miles Davis in the 70s, when Chick Corea and Keith Jarrett and all them were playing Rhodes keyboards, they would play them through Fender amps turned all the way up, so they were distorting. So that was more of like that was more of like, you know, Miles always said, Hendrix was his favorite musician ever, and he did like that kind of thing. So by the time Miles went into that was a legitimate sound. You know, it's just the amp breaking up on its own, the keyboardist, you know, hammering away, and you're getting almost what's the word I'm looking for? The characteristic of a guitar.
And
that
makes a lot of sense. I mentioned bass. I think another interesting function is that the keyboard can fortify the bass and occasionally even replaces the bass. One weird trivia example that I didn't know about until I started looking into this. So, you know, what's Judas Priest's heaviest album? I think a lot of people might say Painkiller. I mean, I would actually say Defenders of the Faith, but turns out that Ian Hill wasn't playing on Painkiller. That was actually Don Airey, who we know is a great keyboardist, playing a mini Moog, playing the bass parts. And now, of course, when they play Painkiller on stage, you don't get a keyboardist coming out or anything. Ian Hill plays the bass parts, but on the studio album, you know, apparently it was Don Airey. So that shows, you know, some versatility there. Another thing that we often see is keyboards will provide an intro or be used for like a bridge part or interlude. So, you know, what would be some examples of that? I think the first thing that comes to mind is probably Mr. Crawley, right? And you've got that organ intro to it. But another interesting example is if you listen to Tank's 1984 Honor and Blood album, they incorporated keyboards on that. Algie Ward played those, and they do a lot. They're providing kind of a deep noise level to it, and then there's like the high level playing over it as well. I also think that there's a lot of metal power ballads as time goes on. It's not as common as like an acoustic guitar, just an electric guitar played low and slow, but it's still pretty prevalent, you know. I mean, sometimes it's piano and but a lot of times it'll be like a synth or, you know, an organ of some sort. And then, you know, once the crescendo comes, the guitars are really taking over, right?
I do want to kind of add a little history to this. a lot of metal players, and I think we all know this as an example. A lot of people say that, like, Bach was so metal because the toccata in D minor, the organ,
Yeah.
I think, and the vision of, the Dracula looking figure that, like, we've come to know, that associate that with, right?
Yeah.
And I think, and of course, a lot of people started calling Blackmore or like Yngwie Bach rock, right? Because
Right. Yeah.
so I think the keyboard and the organ made a lot of sense too, because if you play that, any metalhead will know it and say, well, I'm going to call that metal. He died in 1750, but he was playing metal. Like, he was writing metal for the organ. I think there's some roots to that, and I think that theme is so recognizable and has kind of gone into that gothy kind of metal kind of genre anyway.
Yeah, another interesting thing that I came across that I didn't put into our notes for this is some keyboardists talk about the role of watching horror movies and horror movie soundtracks, which often did use keyboard things. Also the theremin got used a lot, because it's
Right.
got that weird sound to it. You don't see that on stage an awful lot. Right?
No,
But they credited that as being kind of an influence on their keyboard composition.
that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah. I think there's two other roles that keyboards do musically that are particularly important. Some of them are used to provide additional sounds that aren't going to be there in the song. And that could be like, instruments. So, Ken points out Yamaha used to list the number of instrument emulations on their keyboards, right? So you're trying to emulate an oboe if you want that in there
Right.
somehow. I mean, Hawkwind didn't need to emulate an oboe because they actually had a guy playing that once in a while, or the saxophone. But, if you're a regular band, you don't have musicians sitting around getting out there to play some exotic instrument. Or it could be used to make kind of weird sounds. So Hawkwind is a great example of this. They use it to make their space rock. So Silver Machine, you hear that like whooshing in the background. That's coming from the synths. And then I think that it's also used to just sort of like enhance the overall sound, to do some like texturing. It reminds me of when I used to play. I still play the banjo, but I used to play the banjo in a church choir where the organist quit, and some hippy dippy guitar lady came in and took over and became like the new music director. And she played guitar, and we actually had a guy who played spoons and tambourine. And she found out that I played banjo, and she's like, well, you should be playing banjo. And I was like, well, what's a banjo going to contribute? And she said, it's garlic, meaning that in the dish, it adds a little something that makes it better, right? So examples of this, I think, Dio's Rainbow in the Dark.
Right.
Could the little like lilting line be done on the guitar? Yeah, it could have been. If they had two guitarists, but there's something about that keyboard playing that really brings it out in a way that doesn't happen on Jump. Jump is kind of fun, silly. Rainbow in the Dark is a real hardcore metal song. I would say what Queensryche does with their stuff on, Rage for Order, that album, very synth heavy. It's adding something to it, but it's doing it in a very different way than like John Lord's organ in Deep Purple does.
Yeah, and I think in Rage for Order, they were like kind of like orchestral hits sometimes.
Yeah.
And just like real kind of sharp, aggressive, or just well, what's what I'm thinking of, where it's almost like a God, what's the one? But it's a big part of the tune, but it's got this ominous thing to it. So
Yeah.
it's not really right. I guess that's a good distinction. Is it fun, or are you doing it to really, you can make it sound metal? You want these things to like almost like a soundtrack to a horror movie or something, which
Yeah.
it makes sense.
Ken has a really interesting example here from the 70s. Rainbow did the same in Intro to Gates of Babylon. I'd say that's right. You know,
Yeah.
you've got this weird time signature song, and I would say it's essentially the guitar that's driving it. I mean, it's Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, the organ is certainly contributing to it, right?
Yeah. And I think now we're getting into the how is it used.
Yeah.
Whereas I think when we go further on past the 70s, there's discrepancies kind of happen there. Where I think I know we're not there yet, but I think there was kind of more of an appeal to the modern with the production crews rather than it was part of the sound that they came up with in
Yeah.
modular rehearsal space.
I mean, I think part of it too is because the tech is rapidly improving in this time period. By the time that we're getting to the 80s, you really do have the capacity to incorporate a lot of synths that aren't like huge things,
Right.
and they're able to emulate so much more stuff. You don't have to like jack a bunch of things in and out of them, and
Right.
so yeah,
Like
so there's
yeah.
yeah. Well, let's talk about what instruments we've got in mind. So we're going to do a little bit of memory lane with this. And the keyboard instrument that is kind of a predecessor to all this is the piano. And you do see piano used occasionally on power ballads or very introspective pieces. Whenever they're like incorporating a bit of honky tonk, you got a piano piece. But the piano is not great because it's not portable. Trying to bring a piano around on tour, it's heavy, it's big, it gets out of tune really quick.
Yeah.
So it was never a huge draw. And then, we've got organs, and, this goes all the way back. You mentioned Bach, to pipe organs, but
Yes.
those aren't portable at all. You got them stuck in churches for the most
Right.
part. But the Hammond was a very interesting alternative originally to pipe organs in churches and upright pianos for middle-class family homes. And it's an analog instrument. It's got these tone wheels rotating in front of an electromagnetic pickup, which then allows it to be, jacked into an amp. And Hammond will actually bring out the first fully functional music synthesizer with vacuum tubes, the Nova Chord, but it doesn't get used very much. It's kind of ahead of its time. It's complex and costly. And then we get all these interesting electric pianos, which turn out to get used a lot. And there's different ways to make an electric piano work. You can have tuning forks or steel reeds, but again, it's going to electromagnetic pickups. So I guess, could you say that in a certain respect, it's the same technology as electric guitars and basses are relying upon because it's all pickup based? Does that make sense to say that?
The pickup bass is maybe a part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're taking now what was a piano and portability is one thing.
You're producing a sound with an analog format. You're doing something to something. So whether you're plucking a string or hitting a tuning fork, and then it's the pickup that turns it into an electrical signal that can be used and amplified, right?
And altered.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So, like back then in the 70s, they had like phasers or univibes. And when they in the 70s, when they came out with a chorus pedal, like every Rhodes player was using that for a while. That was the thing, is to run it through. So you can, instead of a piano, you can now run it through effects.
Yeah.
And you could choose to run it through a tube amp or direct or however. So yeah, the pickup's definitely a big part of that equation, is that now you've changed the signal to something you can alter further outside of the instrument.
Yeah, and so electric pianos are pretty portable.
Mhm.
They're pretty durable, which matters for bands that are going on tour. There's even a Rhodes piano bass, which has got a shorter keyboard. That was used by the Doors. They didn't have a bassist. They just
Yeah.
actually had like a bass thing on top of the rest of the stuff. And then we get the Mellotron, not used much these days. That one, was kind of cool in some respects because you could do looping with it and it had instrument tape sets, but it was also not great for touring. So sometimes it would just be a studio
Right.
thing. Bands that tried to take the Mellotron on tour often found they'd have to take two because one would inevitably be broken by the time they arrived
Right.
there. And then we get, synthesizers coming out. The Moog, huge in the 70s, really even in the 60s.
Yes.
There you have a legitimate synthesizer. It's not using something analog to make a tone, which then is picked up by a pickup. It's going through electronic music production, or tone production rather,
Mhm.
not even music production. And what was also important about that was it was modular, so you could like jack things in to produce different sounds, even before they had pedals. And then in 1970, Moog releases a compact synth, which, then that really changes things. That allows keyboard players to have that on top of other keyboards. So, you see the familiar, like, cut to the keyboard player, and he's got like 2 or 3 keyboards stacked on
Right.
top of each other, you know. And then it just kind of blows up from there. You get ARP bringing out their stuff. Pete Townsend used that for Bob O'Reilly, that really cool intro
Yep.
loop. We start getting keyboard computers and harmonic synthesizers, so you can now play with the organ. You could play multiple notes. With a synth, at first you could only play a single note, but then once you can start playing chords, that really changes things. And there were workarounds, like you could play an arpeggio and just make it, real close together, and that's kind of like a chord.
Or they would have 2 of them, and they could play
Yeah,
like 2 notes at a time.
yeah,
That was the workaround for sure.
yeah. And then we start getting preset synthesizers, like string machines, where and now we start getting to why synths are being distrusted, because if you can push a button for something that you've already got set up, that's not the same as like getting up there and playing
Right.
in either in the studio or in front of an audience, or what the guitarist is doing. The guitarist can't push a button on their guitar and have the solo come out.
Right. Right. Well, you wouldn't want that. If you think about it, that is a point of, for
Yeah.
uh, I mean, I guess if it's like an intro thing, like or like you think Eminence Front, right?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I wouldn't call that cheating. That was a cool effect. As far as like, if you run a loop on that, but it's another thing if you kind of hit a button and then you're faking playing the solo,
Yeah.
or if it's taking the place of the actual performance rather than enhancing it.
I mean, this goes to what people are upset about with old bands that probably should quit touring, and I'll single out Motley Crue in this case.
Yeah.
People are saying, and it's one thing to have like a singer who's got, I don't know, vocal track because they can't hit the notes anymore. That's not great, but at least that's
No.
understandable. But when Nikki Sixx is not playing his own bass, and it's a bass, it's not a guitar. It's,
Right.
I mean, and Nikki Sixx was never like a Steve Harris level player. I mean, if I suppose if Steve Harris wanted to like fudge a bit, I'd probably forgive him. But Looks That Kill, I mean, how hard is that bass part? And people are saying, yeah, he's up there on stage, and you can tell that he's got a track because the bass playing that he's doing with his hands doesn't match what's happening on the PA, And why are people upset about that? Because they feel like they're paying for some sort of performance that they're not getting.
Well, it's true, and that goes. I mean, if you really think about it, with technology, um, part of, at least in our generation, when you went to a show, even if it was a very similar set list and it was like the same songs, you got a
Yeah.
unique performance of it every night. Like we find this out by, like, now if we go to YouTube and find 6 different songs from the same tour,
Yeah.
the singer might yell something different. The guitar might, put in an extra thing here or there. But if it's going to be the same everywhere you go, meaning you're playing to tracks, you're not really getting the live experience. It's kind of like you've paid to go watch a movie or listen to an album.
Yeah. With people up front miming it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and I think, I mean, I don't even like the idea of singers doing it. I mean, because you're not hearing them sing. If you change the melody, if you can't hit those high notes, or you change the key of the song,
Yeah.
those are things that those are practical workarounds.
Let me actually throw a hypothetical out there to you about this, specifically as a guitarist. So imagine a 4-piece like, say, Black Sabbath, where you've got one guitarist, one singer, bassist, drummer. Tony Iommi on studio albums plays more than one track. So when he's soloing, he's also got another track with the riff. Now, the way that they would handle that typically, if they weren't a 5-piece, which they were at a few points, is to have usually a guy off stage playing rhythm guitar, who is quite often a guy who played keyboards for them, who was in Quartz for a long time. And Jeff Nichols, he often did the second guitarist thing for them. But what if Tony Iommi just, he's going to solo. It's still Tony Iommi. It's a real solo, but he's using a track of his riff. Think about Zero the Hero, right? He's on Zero the Hero, there's 2 guitar parts, right? At most points where he's doing a lick or a solo. Would you, in concert, would you find that objectionable to do that? Should they have a guy in the back playing the rhythm guitar?
I think they should have a guy on stage playing the rhythm guitar, but
Okay.
if the rhythm guitar doesn't happen, that's okay with me. I mean, let's take Dawkins' Beast from the East.
Yeah,
there's a whole vibe to that, like, the guitar, and then there's the bass and the drums, and then there's all the space for the lead guitar, which he kind of fills up with a little delay. Echo. But I mean, people have different opinions than me. But
well, usually bands that are doing that, the bass is doing a somewhat expanded part by comparison to on the riff.
And there you have the live version.
Yeah.
This thing about we have to make it sound exactly like the album, I never liked that, because a lot of times the live version came out better. Or you're always curious to see how the band's going to come up with creatively with the instrumentation they have, how they're going to deal with well, even if there's a twin guitar harmony and there's one guitar, I'd rather just hear one of the parts than have them pipe another one. I would rather hear the actual live version as it's going to be performed by the band. If they want to hire another player for the stage, that's fine too, because, well, now you still have a live performance. But that's, I'm pretty, a lot of people kind of disagree with me. I fall in the it's by case, but I'm pretty set on no tracks.
Okay.
No tracks.
Because there's some good comments here. Before we do that, I'm going to give you another hypothetical. So you're at a concert, and it's in a small place. So it's not like, a huge auditorium, and it's a band, and let's say they're some sort of 4-piece, and they actually announce, okay, we're going to play these songs and we're going to use some tracks on them. But if there's anybody out there who'd like to play second guitar with us on these particular tracks, and just do the rhythm part, just do the riffs, so you're not being called on to do anything particularly strenuous. And let's say they were songs that you already they're in your repertoire, right? Would you be like, hey, That's me. I'll do it. Just, let me get my guitar and I'll be up there on stage with you. Or would you be like, I don't know about that? Would you step up for that?
Would I step up for
Yeah,
it?
you personally.
If I really knew it, absolutely. Although I just think it's a really bad idea, but for the band to do that.
Well, that's
really
how
bad.
See him do that. I mean, as drunk and high as musicians get, I don't think I've ever seen that happen.
Yeah, like just come on up. We have an amp set up for you and everything,
Yeah. All right. Well, let's take some of these. So Andrew has a question, sort of a genre question. I happened to listen to Emerson, Lake and Palmer today, and it got me thinking, when keyboards drive riffs or dominate texture, like Deep Purple or Children of Bodom, do we still perceive the music as metal, or does a default purist assumption of guitar-driven metal music override what we're actually hearing, making it to be something else? Is metalness tied to instrument or sonic effect? So I have a take on this, but I want to hear your take first, Scott.
A sonic effect to me.
Okay.
I don't you might describe a band as guitar driven, but I don't know about a genre necessarily. I mean, if you have keyboards with driving riffs like a B3 through a Marshall, for example, that could still be metal. I mean, there are some bands that are like there's bands like Nine Inch Nails that are heavy bands, but there's a lot of synth and stuff like in that. So I the metalness would not be in the instrument specific, especially, if I were to comment otherwise, I would be thinking that nobody's going to come up with something in the future years, idea wise, for something to be metal. Cause even Depeche Mode gets pretty heavy and they're not guitar heavy.
Right, yeah.
The 90s Depeche Mode. I don't mean the 80s Depeche Mode. The 90s Depeche Mode was pretty heavy stuff. Is it metal? That's debatable, but I think they would work with a metal band on a bill.
Yeah.
So
my take on it is more music history and sort of like genre related. Black Sabbath is perhaps the quintessential early heavy metal band, but Deep Purple is like, if they're not on the same level, they're like almost the same level with them as far as like what counted as heavy metal, who influenced what later bands. Deep Purple is, I would say, as influential as we've seen when we've looked at genre after genre and scene after scene as Deep Purple is. And then you add in other bands using, stuff like UFO on some of the things, obviously Uriah Heep. So the early stuff definitely used a lot. And then, we've talked about like the Black Sabbath, Deep Purple nexus as sort of like a nucleus for all these other bands that come out. As we're going to see as we go through them, a lot of them are using keyboards.
right.
But it's usually organs, like Scott said, driven through an amp, where the organ is functioning like a second guitar in a lot of cases. But doing something different. It's also connecting with the bass in a different way than a guitar does, I think. Andy says, as fans, we want passion, not perfection. That's a great distinction.
Yes,
I would likely not sit ever again to listen to the 18 to 20 minute of Painkiller that we heard live, but live it was mind blowing. It's a very different experience in a live show as an observer or a fan. Yeah. And Painkiller, as a side note, we've talked about this before, Painkiller for the vocalist is an athletic performance.
Yes.
And you could see that in how Rob Halford was positioning his, going on 70s body in order to belt out these notes, but everybody else is, on firing on all cylinders through the song too. It's a real, thing. But yeah, I mean, if I hear like an off note, I'm not going to be like, stop the tapes,
I know.
like that.
Right. I kind of dig the for better or for worse, if somebody's having an off night, there's something about that. And I always go back to this recording when Images and Words came out with Dream Theater. They were doing a live broadcast from Rhode Island on the local radio station. And it was, I think it's clear to me now that John Petrucci didn't warm up. But I mean, it wasn't terrible. It was
Yeah.
great. But like there was some parts where, you know, he'd hit a loose open string would happen, or he'd miss a note, or he'd a sour note. And I recorded that, and I remember listening to that more than the album,
Oh,
because
interesting.
there was something about that, you know. I mean, he was still on fire, but you could hear, you know, he was struggling a little. I mean, most people would never notice. He's a beast.
Yeah.
But there was something about that experience, like that just happened that time. And I started, because they pretty much had that in like an EP, I think, before. So they were pretty much doing the whole Images and Words album.
Yeah.
And that became, so yeah. But the band was on fire, and the sound was different than the album. It wasn't produced or anything. So I think I agree with that. You know, passion, not perfection. Sometimes the imperfect moments add to it. Not that you should have imperfect moments intentionally. It's just how it happens.
You know, that kind of goes back to the concerns that people had about synths, right? Synths could maybe make things a little bit too perfect with too little effort, right?
Interesting.
Yeah. That's
Yeah,
kind
right.
of, oh, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead. No, I was saying, yeah. I mean, with the synths, especially if, you know, if you're using them like tracks, that's,
Yeah.
you know, rather than playing them.
So Ken had a follow-up to that. I had the same feeling about the 10 to 15-minute versions of Heaven and Hell that Black Sabbath used to do
Oh yeah,
live. Wouldn't listen to that on a studio album, but the experience live was amazing. And I think that's quite true. When we have stuff like that on a studio album, we're like, this is kind of self-indulgent. I don't need another drum solo, or, you know,
right.
another bass solo, and, you know, two more guitar solos piled up on stuff. But yeah, when we're there and we're in the moment and there's everybody else around us, we do like that sort of thing. Although I got to say, you know, and Andy will corroborate this, because we actually saw him live. One person who we did not enjoy was Zakk Wylde's Black Label Society, which was sandwiched weirdly in between Thin Lizzy and Judas Priest when we saw them in Reading, Pennsylvania. And the reason was because his solos went on way too long. And all the Black Label Society people who were wearing their, like, you know, fake motorcycle jackets were like, oh man, this is amazing. And we were like, when is this going to be over? You know? And he says it was unbearable. And if it had only been like half, I mean, he's a shredder. So if it had been like half the length, you know, for his soloing, we probably would have been like, yeah, okay, that's not bad, you know? But it really did. It was, you were like, when is this going to end? You know?
Well, that's a really interesting point, because I remember some of my favorite Zakk playing is from No Rest for the Wicked.
Yeah.
And he complains about that album because the producer said, no, you gotta tell some kind of story when you play a solo. You just can't play the same stuff over and over again.
Interesting.
So but here's the part. Zakk is a fantastic guitar player. So he actually had a great time. He had great time and a great feel, and he had like everything to make those statements was executed by like a pro, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of, I think with Zakk Wylde, it's not that he's not a fantastic player, because he is. I think it's it's the attitude thing of, you know, I'm just going to play a lot of notes for a long time. I mean, I saw Generation X, and he did like a 20-minute version of Little Wing, and I didn't need to hear that.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, I think it's somebody else who wouldn't do that sort of thing. Joe Satriani. I mean, amazing guitar player, definitely can solo in whatever thing he wants to, but he's restrained. You know, he'll do this much and then, all right, that's enough, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, Vi and those people, they're, you know, I think back in the day, Satriani on one song would open up, but it was cool because the whole band would come down and come back up. So it wasn't just this constant hitting you over the head until you can't feel it anymore.
Yeah.
So you know, that's a good point.
Yeah. Well, let's move to something else. So, we promised we were going to talk about bands. I do think that it's helpful to talk very briefly about what we could call predecessor bands. So, the use of the keyboard is getting into heavy metal through psychedelic and prog and heavy bands of the 1960s, leading into the 70s to some degree. So, some examples of this, I mentioned the Doors. They don't use a bass. It's just keyboards with a
Right.
bass synth. And that's an interesting thing. Iron Butterfly formed in 1966. Think about Inagata Devita. Some people want to say that's an early heavy metal song, and that's heavy on the organs, right?
Oh,
Jethro Tull. Now, not a heavy metal band, even though they got a Grammy for it at one point, but they've got
right.
a guy on keyboards, Steppenwolf, right? Goldie McJohn on keyboards, one of the pioneers in early use of the electric organ. And then we've got, King Crimson. And there's some debate, should some of their songs be considered early heavy metal? They're definitely prog. They're
Yes.
using the keyboards and synths at different points. We've got Yes. Tony Kaye is on organ, and then Rick Wakeman later on
Yes.
keyboards. And Rick Wakeman's going to show up in Black Sabbath. So he's got some heavy metal credentials, we could say.
Yeah.
We all know the song Hocus Pocus by Focus.
Yep.
Mainly because of its yodeling, I imagine.
Mhm.
And then once you get that riff stuck in your head, it's difficult to get out. There's a keyboard heavy band. Grand Funk Railroad. We usually think of them as like a sort of dirt baggy guitar band, but they're using the keyboards.
Yeah.
Andy mentioned Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. Keith Emerson was one of those very theatrical
Big time.
keyboard players. Yeah. And he was using both the Hammond and the Moog at the same time. So I think one of the ones that I got in my head last night was Rod Argent's, who was first with the Zombies, where he played keyboards, not just organs and stuff like that, but also the mellotron and the harpsichord. And then he formed Argent. And think about Hold Your Head Up, right?
Yeah.
That is really relying on the organ, and it's a heavy song. And then we got Edgar Winter, right? So think about Frankenstein. Is that a proto heavy metal song? Yeah. And he's got his, he's playing his, I guess you don't play it like a guitar. You hold it like in front of you, like this, right?
Right. Yeah.
So
Yep.
all of those things are they're not metal, but they're contributing to the scene, we could say, right?
Right. Yeah. It's their familiar sounds. They're already in our ears, so to speak. And including, I mean, I think the songs that you've mentioned, no matter what genre they're in, if they're our age, they know those songs, even if they're in pop music. They're kind of iconic.
Yeah, a lot of them are what we've called metal adjacent in the past, where
Right.
odds are if you're listening to metal, you also listened to a radio station that played those songs pretty often. So Hold Your Head Up, Frankenstein,
Yeah.
Hocus Pocus, right? You probably can whistle the key riff to it as it's now stuck in your head. So, well, let's talk about another aspect before we go deeper into some of the bands. So, we talked about, like, we mentioned a 5-piece lineup, right? And Deep Purple, prime example of that. How do the keyboards actually fit in? We do see a lot of 5-piece bands, and they are metal bands where the keyboardist, you've got a keyboard instead of a second guitar. So whereas with like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest, 2 Scorpions, 2 guitars, 1 singer, bassist, drummer. In this case, you have 1 of each, we could say. And then the key question will always be something like, how does the keyboard actually fit in? So in some bands, the keyboardist is a full member of the band and is integral to the sound of the band. So Deep Purple, perfect example of that. Rainbow, I would say, even after they got softer, you know, and they're moving to synths instead of an organ. Interestingly, Gillan, his band had that, but it's not a big surprise because he was with Deep Purple.
Right.
Rough Cut, where Claude Schnell's going to come from. Early Ozzy Osbourne is using keyboards. Pretty much all the Dio stuff that we're going to come across. And then, you know, we've got some other ones that stand out. And we could say that, so you mentioned like Bach rock, or sometimes it's called like classical metal or neoclassical metal, but we could also talk about power metal in general. And I think that you could claim that Yngwie Malmsteen does fit in there. His band has a keyboard. Europe, I mean,
Oh yeah,
you all know the keyboard line on that one.
Yeah, right.
Dream Theater, you mentioned. What's that?
They used it on all their stuff. I mean, not that hooky, but
yeah.
But like, you know, there was like pads and stuff, and sometimes solos even. So Europe, yeah.
Stradivarius. So those are all bands where no keyboard, there's something definitely missing to the band. You couldn't have Deep Purple without John Lord. Well, you can, but then you got to replace him with Don Airey, you know.
And the Yngwie thing is interesting because the first few albums, Jans Johansson was the keyboardist.
Yeah.
And they would trade off solos.
Yeah.
You know, and that by the late 80s or whatever, that kind of disappeared. It became more guitar. And then I guess now he has a keyboardist that plays like you like a lot of the keyboard based songs like from Odyssey or whatever, or Trilogy.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I think in most people's mind, unless you've listened to Yngwie recently, you think, oh, Guitar Hero, he's doing this really cool classical stuff, but you don't think about the rest of the band.
That's right. Now it's just a few guys that have occupy a quarter of the stage while he has 3/4 of the stage. Which is a far cry from what he used to do. You know, everybody was part of the band. You knew their names.
Yeah.
Back then. So,
I mean, this is a side note, but I think we could say that about some other long-lived players. You get kind of something like that with Wasp, right? They're all a bunch of young guys hanging around Blackie Lawless. They're definitely not getting the kind of billing that he is.
Right.
Or, you know, I think we could maybe Michael Scheckner to some degree. I might be misremembering having seen him in concert, but I mean, he's the guy who's front and center, you know?
Yes.
And you kind of don't care about who else is playing with him that much.
As long as they're really good.
Yeah. They don't screw up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So another possibility is to have like a bigger band where you might even have 2 keyboards. Hawkwind was like that. Uriah Heep at points. And weirdly, Whitesnake at some points had 2 keyboardists. And we usually think of them as mostly a guitar band, and then we think of David Coverdale. But, you know, John Lord played with them for a while. Then we also have other 5 pieces where you've got a keyboardist who will also do some other instrument. So Blue Oyster Cult, all the early stuff, Alan Lanier on keyboard and rhythm guitar. Once they added Paul Raymond to UFO, he's a double threat, keyboard and guitar. Michael Scheckner Group, Steve Mann does the same thing. King Diamond is kind of a weird one. I mean, they're weird just period, but you've got both King Diamond, who's the vocalist, and Andy LaRocque also doing keyboards from time to time. Queensryche, Chris DeGarmo played keyboard on their stuff as well as guitar. And then you got Faith No More towards the end of the 80s doing that. Mm-hmm. So that's a viable arrangement, right?
Yeah. But they always had but the times I saw Queensryche, I don't remember if the keyboardist was on stage or not. It's interesting.
We saw them recently on a small stage at Summerfest. I don't recall seeing keyboards, but there were definitely keyboards being played on some of the songs off of Operation Mindcrime, Rage for Order, some of
Yeah.
those things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now there's, oh, go ahead.
No, I said, yeah, right. Yeah. Especially off those albums, you need it. And I'm thinking, I saw Jeff Tate because one of my students plays for Jeff Tate.
Yeah.
And
He's got a keyboardist in
he's
his
got a
version.
Yeah, he's got 3 guitarists too. He's got 3 guitarists.
That's a packed stage then.
That is because they don't, where I saw him, the stage wasn't that big.
Yeah.
So there wasn't a lot of, I mean, they had to leave room for Jeff to be theatrical, of course.
Yeah. Another possibility that you see a lot of is a 4-piece or a 3-piece where one of the band members will, do anything from actually play keyboards like a lot to just dabbling, mixing it in. So, Black Sabbath, interestingly, in some studio stuff, they puttered around. Even Ozzy has a few songs where he played keyboards. I didn't know that because I've always thought of him as, well, the only instrument he plays is the harmonica, but no,
right.
he plunked around a bit. Quartz, we mentioned already, Jeff Nichols, Rush, think about Geddy Lee, right?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
There's what was it maybe Tom Sawyer? There's a video where he's singing, he's playing bass, and he's doing keyboards. It's like a house in the middle of snow. Is that ring a bell?
Their videos for moving pictures at that studio. I think that's where they recorded. But,
okay.
Right, because they had to do 2 takes because Geddy Lee's playing bass, but he's also, there's another scene where he's playing just keys.
Yeah.
Rather than, as I remember it. That and Limelight. I think Limelight was one of the videos from there too, if I don't remember.
Okay.
But yeah.
Weirdly, I didn't know this until we started looking into it. Angel Witch, the bass player, Kevin Riddles, actually played keyboards on some of their stuff. Another new wave of British heavy metal band that really should have gone a lot further than they did, but maybe that's why people don't know. Holy Divers, the Holy Diver album of Dio, it wasn't Claude Schnell on keyboards. He played on the tour, but it was actually both Dio and Jimmy Bain who played the keyboard part. So that, beautiful stuff in Rainbow in the Dark and Holy Diver, that's all those guys puttering around with it. Not a surprise because Dio apparently could play any instrument he wanted to. But it was a surprise to find out that Jimmy Bain, who we know is a great bassist, was also into keyboards. Van Halen, of course, Eddie Van Halen loves the keyboards. Tank, Algie Ward starts playing keyboards on Honor and Blood. Chris Oliva and Savatage plays the keyboards. So you get a lot of people doing that sort of stuff. And then another thing that's quite common is where you've got like a 4-piece with an additional keyboardist who fills in. And Black Sabbath, they used a lot of keyboardists. Kiss, none of those guys played the keyboards, apparently. They just hired somebody to do it. And then,
or Bruce Kulick used to play it live.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Like for Reason to Live, Bruce played keyboards on that one, like live.
I hadn't thought of that. Yeah. So that would turn him into like one of those guys who also does it,
Yes. Well, they would. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Now there's a couple comments. Andy's got some stuff with Ken going back and forth about the Who. So these are people, we're going back to the instrument thing. If you incorporate exotic instruments like Mongolian instruments, can it still be metal? And the answer is sure. It depends, like Scott said, on the sonic profile,
right.
Which I guess you could say it depends less on that instrument and more on what the bass and the drums and the guitar are doing as well, right?
Yeah, well, where the bass is positioned is important too, depending on the, it's definitely one of the factors. The sound,
yeah,
it's got to have space. That's the thing with Van Halen that I didn't like on some of the stuff later on is Eddie's tone was so sonically fat. It had a lot of low end. And then that became, I mean, on the albums, not
Yeah.
live. The albums, there was like less bass definition because there wasn't as much room for it.
Yeah, I think, I've never really wrapped my head that well around why I don't like the post David Lee Roth albums. I just know that I don't that much. They're not terrible, but they don't measure up to that. And now that you say that, that actually gives me some idea about what's going on. I mean, I also think there's like too much keyboard stuff in there, but
Yeah.
that could be like you're so used to one form of Van Halen. Maybe Van Hagar is really a different band than David Lee Roth era.
Totally. Yeah. You had a different songwriter involved.
That's true. Yeah.
So and in technology, I wonder, we always do the what ifs, like what if Van Halen did a couple more albums after 1984 before Roth left. I wonder what they would sound like, if they would sound like those, if they would have gone back to the rock thing, or if they would have continued with the keyboards.
Yeah. I mean, I can say I saw Van Halen with Sammy Hagar early on twice. Once in 1986, so that would have been the 5150 tour, and then I saw them in Monsters of Rock, where they were the headliner. So that would have been after OU 812, I think. And they weren't playing on the 5150 tour. They were still playing a good bit of like pre David Lee Roth stuff, or David Lee Roth era stuff. But
really?
Yeah, but by Monsters of Rock, they played like maybe 4 songs in their set of older Van Halen stuff. And then it was all like the new stuff or covers. And I remember Sammy Hagar bringing, he was definitely a more restrained singer. He could also play the guitar. He and Eddie would get up on stage and play back and forth. And there wasn't a lot of like Eddie going over to the keyboards and doing stuff on those, but I think that became more prevalent later on. Now there's a couple interesting comments here. So we'll do Andrew's first, because then I want to talk about the Iron Maiden thing a bit, because there's some people considered them to be a bit hypocritical.
Right.
So Andrew says, could it be keyboards thrived in regions where metal fused with local traditions like classical, opera, folk, or Japanese theatricality, whereas the US, UK had a more blues punk lineage, making keyboards feel more foreign, especially thrash. So, I mean, classic thrash doesn't have any room for keyboards, I would say.
No.
And you don't really see it much now. When it's used, it's more like giving, background effects, and there's a bit more room for it in black metal. Although I guess there's controversies about, are the keyboards okay to have in that? I mean, I would say the US, UK, part of what we're showing here is that, no, there was a lot of use of the keyboards. It was the question, what are you doing with the keyboards? Are they heavy, like in Deep Purple or UFO, or when Black Sabbath often incorporates them? Or is it this is not fair, but I'm gonna say Europe's Final Countdown, it is a little cheesy. Maybe it's not representative of Europe as a whole, but it's the one song that everybody knows,
right? And it became their
and people hear that and they're like, this is really a little bit too much pop, not really metal. Now other areas, I mean, I think Japanese bands could incorporate keyboards if they wanted to or not, and it wasn't an issue. We talked about that when we were looking at that scene. And if you're doing stuff that does connect with folk or classical or opera, I guess, I mean, if it's classical, the piano is a classical instrument, so that opens the way. Folk, you can get to incorporate all sorts of stuff, right? So I think there's something to that. What do you think, Matt?
I mean, it's not like Western classical didn't exist here. And I think a lot of a lot of these people started with like classical piano lessons. Like I know Eddie Van Halen said
right.
Yeah. And I just, I think when you're talking about the Japanese bands, they were copying American bands. So it's kind of like whatever we were doing.
Or British bands, yeah.
Yeah. Like Eastern metal, that was doing a lot of copying. I think it's interesting because with the metal musicians, like classic metal, there seemed to be a lot of different influence and stuff. Of course, we know there's blues in there. Blackmore, there's a lot of blues in there. But yeah, I mean, it's like using classical composition and stuff, which was, if you go back, it was all acoustic instruments. But you could use those also as kind of an effect too, I guess, like an acoustic guitar, a nylon string guitar, in the right way.
Yeah.
Any of that stuff. So I don't know. I mean, it's definitely a good thing. It's a clever point,
Yeah.
Now,
Andrew, or Ken rather, brings up the fact that Maiden frequently have a keyboardist when they play live. The poor chap is just backstage. And I mean, they're kind of committed to that because they started using so somewhere in time it's guitar synths, and it's not an actual like keyboardist doing stuff, but Seventh Son of the Seventh Son has a keyboard on it. And so if you're going to play stuff from that, I mean, unless I guess you replace the keyboard parts with somebody playing guitar, there's no way around it. And they've already got 6 guys on stage. They're going to put a keyboardist, for a few songs on the stage. I just don't see them doing that. But yeah, it is kind of, I don't know. It does seem like kind of a put down to have somebody, whether they're the rhythm guitarist or they're the keyboardist, off stage,
Yeah, that always kind of bothered me when they had the off stage. I mean, there's 2 points to it. I'm glad somebody's really playing the part, but if somebody's really playing the part, why aren't they on stage? You might as well have a track at that point, because they're not, if the keyboard parts are important to the song, the person playing the part should be visible. That's just my opinion, though. I mean,
I think there's an argument to be made there, and that's like a strong ethical judgment that I think a lot of people could get behind.
Yeah. I think I saw the Somewhere in Time tour. I don't remember any keyboards. It was, I mean, the Somewhere in Time songs were pretty raw. Like, they were definitely like a metal band playing the songs from that, without the keyboard parts or the synth parts. But
now Ken says there's a story in which Maiden did a concert in Germany where they swapped instruments for a joke. And then now the thing with the you can't play metal with keyboards, that was a Polish fan, because I actually saw the footage yesterday, and they were playing at a wedding in Poland. And a guy comes up and he's like, he's talking in kind of broken English. I really like heavy metal, but I want to play on keyboards. And Bruce Dickinson looks at him and he's like, you can't play heavy metal on keyboards, mate. And that's basically the whole thing. And then the guy's like, but I really, really want to. And that would have been, so Somewhere in Time tour.
That was a Peace of Mind.
When did they actually go to Poland? 85?
Oh, good question. That would have been Power Slave then.
Yeah, it wasn't 84, which would have been the Peace of Mind tour, but they weren't using synths until Somewhere in Time. So
I think I just want to tap off the German story. I thought that was Top of the Pops, where they were supposed to be lip syncing, and they were really mad about that, so they kept switching. They kept switching instruments just to show that they weren't actually playing, and they wanted to make fun of that they were like playing the track to Wasted Years.
Wasn't Steve Harris singing? I think.
Yes, Steve Harris was the only one that kept on his instrument was Adrian Smith, and I always wondered if it's because he wrote the song, and
Okay.
he wanted to like take it seriously because it was his song. But Adrian Smith's the only one that like stayed doing what he should be doing.
Yeah. I mean, that was a great way to drive it home, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about we've mentioned a lot of different things. Let's talk about some bands specifically. So we've already mentioned Deep Purple, massive, importance. And as I mentioned, when Lord actually becomes ill, he's going to get replaced by another giant, Don Airey. So, their entire time that they've been around, it's been something. Uriah Heep, similarly, Ken Hensley joins in February 1970, and they brought him on to widen the sound. So one of the things they said is we'd recorded half of the first album, and then we decided that keyboards would be really good for our sound. And he winds up being a really integral member of Uriah Heep for their early to mid 70s period. Now, Black Sabbath, you could say, well, Black Sabbath didn't use keyboards. But yes, they did. In 1972, Yes opens for Black Sabbath, and Rick Wakeman becomes friends with the Sabbath members. They actually consider expanding Black Sabbath to a 5-piece and inviting him into the band. And he records piano and mini Moog parts on Sabra Cadabra and contributes some other stuff. And then on the Sabotage tour, they get this guy, Gerald Woodruff, who also records on Technical Ecstasy. And you could say, well, that's when Sabbath was going into decline. Technical Ecstasy is kind of an experimental thing. But, it's still a Sabbath album.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Don Airey plays on Never Say Die, the last one in the Ozzy era. And then they get this guy, Jeff Nichols, who plays as a second guitarist, also plays bass when Geezer Butler isn't able to do it. And then he moves to keyboards, and he is on the albums from Heaven and Hell all the way to 1995's Forbidden. So, the stuff that's happening with the weird effects in Born Again, like with the deep, that's Jeff Nichols. So he is definitely involved there. So you can't really say that Black Sabbath, constitutes an exception to this. They're using keyboards. Rainbow, obviously, as you can well expect, if you know anything about Richie Blackmore and his penchant for firing people, there's a lot of keyboardists. Right. So there's Mickey Lee Soul, who records Rising, who then promptly gets fired after recording parts of Long Live Rock and Roll. David Stone does Long Live Rock and Roll, then he leaves, then Don Airey joins, and he plays on Down to Earth and Difficult to Cure. David Rosenthal, by the way, fellow Berkeley person, he graduated from Berkeley. He auditions for Rainbow, and then he plays on Straight Between the Eyes and Bent Out of Shape. And then Rainbow goes to funk because, Blackmore rejoins Deep Purple.
Right.
UFO has a couple different people. Danny Peyronel, who plays on No Heavy Petting. Then we have Paul Raymond on Lights Out, Obsession, No Place to Run. And then we get a couple other keyboardists. Quartz obviously uses keyboards because Jeff Nichols is there. The Gillan Band, the only person, because you may or may not know this, those of you who are listening, Ian Gillan, after he leaves Deep Purple, this might actually be part of what goes into the lore that's informing Spinal Tap. He actually does do like a jazz fusion group, the Ian Gillan Band, and doesn't take him long where he's like, well, this is bullshit. I don't really like this anymore. The only person who he keeps from that band is the keyboardist, Colin Towns. And he does a 5-piece thing, just like Deep Purple. And they do it for 6 heavy metal albums until he joins Deep Purple again. Whitesnake, John Lord plays in Whitesnake, and he's on all the albums from Trouble to Slide It In. And then who do they get after that? I mean, you notice we're getting like some of these key characters popping up. over and over again, really contributing to heavy metal through their keyboard work. Don Airey shows up again on the Whitesnake 1987 album that might be one of their biggest,
Yeah,
and Slip of the
legendary
Tongue. What's that?
That was kind of a legendary album for the genre.
Yeah.
Kind of, so that's, that's a big one. There, it's funny because I remember even metalheads, it worked so well for some reason on that album. People we were trying to find out which keyboard was used on that album back then, and one of my friends claimed it was I don't know the model, but it was a Peavey keyboard, believe it or not.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it was kind of like it was one of those, we actually want to know which one was used, because there's a good amount of keyboards on there.
Yeah, so all of these are prime examples of bands in the 70s who are arguably metal, some of them incontrovertibly so, like Black Sabbath and Rainbow and Deep Purple. Michael Schechner, when he's known as a guitar hero, but he starts out, once again, Don Airey is playing with him.
Hardest working man in the business.
Yeah, and then Paul Raymond, another big guy who was with UFO, plays with him, and then he's got a whole succession of keyboard players, but he's always got a keyboard there in the mix. I guess he picked that up from his UFO days. Ozzy Osbourne, those early albums, again, Don Airey, on Blizzard of Oz and Bark at the Moon. And there's a lot of other keyboardists who are like backup musicians, either touring or session, including Rick Wakeman. And apparently Zakk Wylde even played some keyboard parts here and there later on.
He taught piano lessons. Really quick, I want to clarify something. The famous After Dark Ozzy Osbourne performance in that studio, and it looks like some roadies playing the intro to Mr. Crawley. That wasn't Don Airey, was it? Does anybody remember seeing that? I think it was called After Dark or something, and it was a Blizzard of Oz band. And then it's this guy that's with this black concert t-shirt and jeans. It looks like he just finished setting up the set. This guy plays the intro to Mr. Crawley on that. If anybody knows who that guy was, or if that was actually Don Airey, I'd be kind of curious. That would
be interesting to know, yeah.
Because he just looks like some guy they pulled out of the crowd or something, like some guy that just finished hammering up a stage or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, that's I wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, and then the other side of Black Sabbath singers, Dio, the whole time there's a keyboard player. At first, like we remarked, it's Jimmy Bain and Dio playing in the studio on that first album, but then after that, Claude Schnell, who toured with them, becomes a permanent member of the band. And interesting that you brought up Jens Johansson. When Schnell leaves, Johansson takes over on keyboards and he plays on Lock Up the Wolves, and then Scott Warren takes over. So, and he only leaves because Dio dies. So that's, can you say that Dio isn't metal? I don't think so. He's right in the center of all of it. Van Halen, even before 1984, Eddie Van Halen is sneaking in some keyboard stuff. And the Cradle Will Rock actually uses a electric piano that's put through the Marshalls with a flanger. So that's part of that sound. Fair Warning has Sunday Afternoon in the Park, which is like a short 2-minute song before one of the other tracks. And then we get 1984, and there it's not the electric piano, it's actual synths. Queensryche we mentioned already. They're, keyboards are pretty important in their sound. I would say Operation Mindcrime, it's used quite a bit, but Rage for Order, it's playing a big role. And then we get all these, European bands where, to go back to Andrew's question. So, you could say that, so Rising Force is not a Swedish band, even though it's a Swedish musician, because he's doing it in LA.
Right.
But Jens Johansson is not an American musician. The guy he's got on
No.
keyboards, right? And then you've got Stradivarius from Finland, Europe from Sweden, King Diamond from Denmark. All of those are using keyboards pretty extensively, and I would say, it's to contribute to the sound. It's filling things in a lot. And then Scott mentioned Dream Theater earlier. They've got Jordan Rudess on keyboards all the way through the 80s into the early 90s. And so these are all like major metal bands that keyboards play a significant role in. And this isn't even like talking about like Motley Crue having the piano on Home Sweet Home or
Right.
stuff like that. This is central to their musical profile.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So a couple interesting questions here, and then we're probably gonna have to wrap up before too long because unfortunately I have to go to a board meeting. Andrews is going to the darker side of metal when Dimmu Borgir or Emperor use organ-like synths in their music. Are they staging deliberate blasphemy or dependent on the church's sonic authority to achieve their sound, operating in the shadow of that which they strive to reject? That's an interesting question. So Ken says, I think they did and do. A lot of black metal bands deliberately subvert religious themes and sermons in their music. So deliberately doing the same with instruments would be entirely consistent. And you could say like one of the early precursors of that, not with organ, but with voice, is Venom's Buried Alive, right? There's like this whole 1.5-minute intro where a guy is like essentially preaching a sermon at a funeral, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, we consign this body to the earth. So I guess you could say that incorporating a churchy sounding organ is deliberately trying to play on that.
Yeah, I mean, if you're using a church like organ, yeah, you're at least trying to emote that.
Yeah. So I guess the kinds of organs, it'd be like pipe organ from, like a big cathedral, or it would be the kind of organs that maybe those of us who grew up going to church heard a lot of and can probably easily picture the sound of, that you don't hear in a lot of other things.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't really like, this is a personal thing, I didn't really like that particular sound myself. I suppose because I associate it with like boring Sundays,
right,
and having to listen to a sermon,
right,
trying to figure out what to do for an hour.
Well, so, the sound certainly like the different, that's something kind of interesting just to make note of this notion of not only organ but which organ, the C3, the B3, the pipe organ, they all had their own, they all emote different themes or memories even or context, I should say.
Yeah, they have different sort of like what in language we call connotations of words, right? It's not the direct. So the denotation is like what the word means, right? And so I guess sonically that would be like, what kind of tone do you actually have? And then there'd be all the emotional and memory resonances of, well, what does this evoke? What does this sound like without necessarily pointing at it,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right, exactly.
I mean, we could say that too for like, think about the importance of the Hammond organ in 1970s heavy metal bands that are using keyboards, Deep Purple, Uriah Heep, to some extent UFO, Rainbow. What is it actually doing? If you were going to try to do that today, I mean, you would emulate it through a synth now. You wouldn't like drag a Hammond organ around with you. I mean, actually, here's a technical question for you, Scott. Could you get, like you mentioned, taking an organ and jacking it into Marshalls and overdriving it? Nowadays, everybody plays through a PA. Could you actually get like the same effect sonically doing that through a PA with a synth as you would with an old Marshall organ through, not a Hammond organ through Marshall stacks?
You can emulate it, but it's not going to have the same thing to it. You can,
Okay.
it's like you simulate it, like I'm sure like a flight simulator is sort of what it's like to fly a plane, but not really what it's like to fly a plane.
Yeah.
But I've always asked about that, because technology, as far as like, well, you could get the same sound with just this, this little device. Well, you can't. You can approximate it, and nobody will know the difference. But unless you've A/B'd it to people, you don't know if they're. In other words, I call that they're going to get what we give them syndrome, where it's like they rationalize this, like to a point, technology has its diminishing returns, and nothing will ruin a rock show, like a real rock show, if the guitar is just playing through digital amps and they're not real amps, they're simulating like Marshalls. People will feel it differently than if there was like actual stage volume coming off. I'm talking in rock. I think all that stuff, like all the in-ears and the no sound on stage, I think that's good for like a musical, but not a rock show. So to answer your question, like kind of broadly like that, is you could kind of do it, but if the real thing were to happen halfway through the show, you would notice a huge difference.
Yeah. Now Ken brings up something about like later genres that do have their roots, let's say in the 80s, but then really grow on their own. So he says, while we're talking genres, organ/keyboards is also essential for the grandiose theatrical sound of power and gothic metal. And yeah, that was something I was thinking about as we were like working on this. There's certain genres where the keyboards,
yes,
it makes a lot of sense to have them. Power metal, definitely, as we mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of room in thrash for keyboards.
No, that's the room is the right word.
Yeah. I mean, you could use them in doom, but you're not gonna be keyboard heavy in doom metal, I think. It's got to be more like guitar riffs. Yeah. Gothic metal, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if industrial metal really is metal, obviously keyboards are like used heavily in that.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you mentioned 9 Inch Nails. They're definitely heavy. Certainly people who are into metal were listening to 9 Inch Nails. Ministry would be like another example. I mean, what other genres really that have developed really would be using keyboards a lot?
I mean, if you're talking about rock and roll, I mean, you could definitely get away with organ or any of the classic instruments.
Yeah,
like a Rhodes or with rock and roll, that stuff is all fair game. Although with rock and roll, there might be people might object to, kind of like, well, let's go back to the Jump example, because I think it's the best. That, like that kind of like real happy. Well, the tune's happy, but like the sound's also kind of that way too.
I mean, it's interesting because on that album, the two most synth-heavy songs are "Jump" and "All Wait." And the way that the keyboards are being used in those, very, very different. "All Wait" is a dark, dark song.
It is, yeah,
super keyboard driven. That was the whole reason I wanted that album, because I heard that and I was like, "Wow, this is awesome stuff."
I like me too, and the guitar solo in that is so great. But it's definitely a dark tune, and the keyboards are like kind of a big part of that.
Yeah. "Jump" I was less sold on.
that was the one that they came out of the gates with too. So I was that was the first hit, the single they put out, and I was like, oh, I don't know. Well,
So
see, with Just Be Love from 5150, they led with that one, and I was like, oh, I don't know about that one, because it was like the 5150 jump, you know.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess, to ramp it up, we could say that if you're going to use keyboards, you better make sure that you know what you're doing and you've got somebody who really can play them well and fit into a metal band. Probably doesn't hurt to have them be one of the original players in the band, like John Lord was for Deep Purple, rather than just adding a guy in, and we've also seen there's like all these names recurring. There was like a stable, we could say, of heavy to heavy metal keyboard players who really managed to make a whole career and a lot of great music out of their use of the keyboards. So
yeah.
Oh, Andrew, so here's a good one to go out on. Andrew says, what about today? Is the iPhone a new keyboard with its apps and recording abilities? There was a band called Inner Party System that played a gig using only iPhones. In this sense, are keyboards instruments or musical platforms, ever-changing interfaces, blurring composition, performance, and production? So that's one I'm going to punt over to you, Scott, because I don't have an answer to that. But what do you think?
Not necessarily. The iPhone, I realize, is an example. I mean, it depends on what kind of music they're playing. I mean, it wouldn't. I can't imagine people getting on the stage with iPhones and playing rock. Pop the ultimate stretches the 80s and 90s emulation on a keyboard. Yeah, I mean, I think Ken's right. I think Andrew's example is great. But I always have this thing where it's some kind of fallacy where it's like, well, if you've agreed to technology once, you have to agree with it all the time. Like, you didn't have a hard time back in the 70s when it went to this. Why wouldn't you have a hard time with a guy just plugging in his laptop and playing a rock show on it?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Where it's like you've agreed to it in one instance. I mean, it depends on what kind of music the band's playing. If you're playing it on all iPhones, I don't know. I mean, it would depend if I liked the music or not, or if they were really playing, or I can't imagine that being entertaining, because we see people on their phones all the time.
It can be entertaining as a gimmick, right? It doesn't have staying power to it. You wouldn't go to like buy tickets to a concert with a bunch of people getting their iPhones out and doing little things on it like that. You'd be like, well, hell, I could do that,
Yeah, and people keep saying, that we have this thing change with the times, although the times change every 6 months. So like now, it's changing so fast. There's no staying power with anything with technology. I'm kind of curious. I'm more interested in creativity, and if somebody does something really creative with something, I'm interested in that. But yeah, I would say that kind of sounds gimmicky. Is it the new keyboard? I think is your point. Where I guess it would be, I'd have to hear it, I'd have to hear these, but like, it wouldn't be entertaining. I don't know if I would, if you said I've got tickets to see these people play music on their iPhones, I probably wouldn't go. I mean, something seems to me, it sounds like it's kind of like anybody can write a song now, because we have AI. Do you want to hear my songs now? I'm a songwriter too. And I'm not really interested in that, because I don't know if that artistry comes from years of dedication and messing up and developing your own sound and your own style. And then when you've got AI, you've just got other people's style meshed in, and it's doing is emulating other people's songwriting tendencies, which a human could do. I could, if you told me to write a couple Beatles-like songs, I could do that. You don't necessarily need AI to do that, but it is a tool for people to kind of say that I've heard the term, I'm an AI songwriter, and that's not, I stop there, because you're not a songwriter.
It's an oxymoron.
Yeah, it's an oxymoron.
The terms contradict each other. Yeah.
Yeah. Just because there's technology doesn't mean it's 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 going to be acceptable, I
Yeah.
guess, you know.
Well, that's a great place to bring this to a close. So thanks to everybody for
Yeah, thanks
showing up
everyone.
and questions and stuff like that. Scott, you any last words that you want to convey about, do you wish that you'd played the keyboard instead of the guitar?
I
Probably
play a
not.
little. I play a little keyboards, but I think it, used in the right way. I think we've outlined ways that it's been very successful, and kind of where
Mm,
maybe bands that we had, like, maybe it wasn't to our taste how they used it. And I think a lot of those times it was when production was like, we've got this new synthesizer, and it becomes sort of an advertisement, or this is the way
yeah,
things are now. I think when the missteps were when it came from trends rather than a bunch of people getting together and making something out of it. So the keyboard can be great, or it can not be great, like anything else, So,
yeah,
so I, it was definitely really cool to also see all the names of the people that played.
yeah.
That was a good one. That was
You can
great.
see them like recurring over and over again in the same milieu, contributing to it in a number of different overlapping ways. So,
Mm.
all right. Well, that brings it to a close. So thanks to everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Great to hear from you all.